Sometime in the spring of 1968, a 22-year-old graduate student at the University of Michigan named Arlo Tatum opened his mailbox and found a pamphlet he had not requested, published by an organization he had never heard of, warning him about the dangers of communist infiltration on American college campuses. He threw it away. What he did not know, could not have known, was that an agent of the United States Army had been sitting in the back of his political science class for 3 weeks, copying down names from the attendance roster, photographing the faces of students who raised their hands during discussions of the draft, and forwarding those names and photographs to a database maintained in a nondescript government building outside Washington, D.C., where a team of military intelligence analysts were constructing files on American civilians at a rate of roughly 1,000 new entries per month. Tatum had not broken any law. He had not been charged with anything. He had not been accused of anything. He had attended lectures, signed a petition against the war in Vietnam, and shown up at a campus rally where someone handed him a flyer. That was enough. His name went into the system. By 1971, that system, the Army's domestic surveillance program, formerly housed under a project called CONUS Intel, held files on approximately 100,000 American civilians, students, professors, journalists, members of Congress, civil rights lawyers, pediatricians who had written op-eds opposing the draft, a congressman from New York who had voted against a military appropriations bill. None of them spies, none of them foreign agents, all of them Americans who had done nothing more dangerous than hold an opinion the government found inconvenient, and who had expressed that opinion at a moment when 3 separate federal agencies, the Army, the FBI, and the National Security Agency, were simultaneously running overlapping, largely uncoordinated surveillance programs against the domestic population, programs so expansive and so deeply embedded in the institutional cultures of the agencies running them that their operators had long since stopped asking whether they were legal and had simply begun treating the question as beside the point, as a procedural nicety that the urgency of the situation rendered academic. This is the story of how the United States government, during the Vietnam War era, built a surveillance apparatus aimed at its own citizens, not to stop terrorism, not to catch foreign spies, not to prevent violence, but to monitor, catalog, infiltrate, and in many cases actively disrupt the lawful political activity of ordinary Americans who disagreed with government policy. It is a story that begins not with malice, but with anxiety, with officials who genuinely believed they were under siege, who looked at the campus demonstrations and the street marches and the draft card burnings and saw not a democracy arguing with itself, but the early stages of revolution, and who responded by doing what governments do when they are frightened of their own people. They started watching. And then, because watching was not enough, because watching produced files, and files produced the illusion of control, and the illusion of control produced the appetite for actual control, they started acting. They disrupted. They infiltrated. They forged. They fabricated. They tried, with the resources of the most powerful law enforcement and intelligence apparatus in the world, to destroy organizations and individuals whose offense was expressing, in public and through lawful means, the view that their government was wrong. The machinery they built to do this was large and complex and overlapping, and for nearly a decade, almost entirely invisible to the people it was being used against. When it finally became visible, when the documents came out, when the committees investigated, when the whistleblowers spoke, the picture that emerged was not the picture of a government that had made mistakes under pressure. It was the picture of a government that had made decisions sustained those decisions across multiple administrations and multiple agencies, and constructed institutional frameworks to ensure that the decisions could be carried out without accountability. The mistakes were real. The decisions were realer. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to start with the moment the government first convinced itself that the anti-war movement was a threat rather than a nuisance. And that moment came not gradually, but in a specific week, in a specific city, in the summer of 1967. The Detroit riots killed 43 people and destroyed 2,000 buildings in 5 days. Newark had burned 2 weeks earlier. Dozens of other cities had seen unrest that summer. 159 race-related disturbances in American cities in a single year, by one count. And Lyndon Johnson, watching his great society come apart against the backdrop of a war he could not win and would not end, made a decision that would shape the next decade of American domestic policy. He ordered an inquiry into whether the riots were being coordinated, whether there was a communist hand behind the chaos, whether the violence was organized or spontaneous. The answer that came back from his intelligence officials was, in the main, that it was spontaneous, a product of poverty, police brutality, and years of accumulated rage that had been building in American cities since the end of the Second World War. Rage that the civil rights movement had given language and the Vietnam War had given additional fuel, and that had finally found its expression in fire and broken glass and the sound of sirens in 100 American nights. But by the time that answer arrived, the machinery of surveillance had already been activated, and once that machinery was running, the people running it found it very difficult to turn off, partly because bureaucratic machinery never turns off easily, and partly because the answer, that the unrest was spontaneous, that it was the product of American conditions rather than foreign manipulation, was not the answer that the people who had activated the machinery wanted to receive, and so they kept the machinery running in hopes of finding a different one. The Army, which had been tasked with contingency planning for civil disturbances since the early 1960s, and which had been called in to help restore order in Detroit and Newark and other cities, took its mandate and quietly extended it. The Directorate of Civil Disturbance Planning and Operations, a body that had existed primarily to think about logistics. How many troops would be needed to restore order in a city? How quickly could they be deployed? What legal authorities governed the use of military force against domestic civilian populations? Began collecting intelligence on the people and organizations it deemed likely to cause the disturbances in the first place. The logic was the logic of anticipation. If you know who is going to cause trouble before they cause it, you can prepare for it more effectively, perhaps prevent it. The logic was not entirely wrong, but it contained no natural stopping point, no principle that established when enough intelligence had been collected, no criterion for distinguishing between the person who was genuinely planning violence and the person who had simply attended a meeting of people who were angry about the same things that the person planning violence was angry about. And in the absence of that criterion, the collection expanded and expanded, feeding on its own output, until the database that was supposed to help the Army prepare for civil disturbances had become a comprehensive registry of American political dissent that bore almost no relationship to the operational purpose that had justified its creation. The Army had no legal framework for domestic intelligence collection. This is the foundational fact around which everything else in the CONUS Intel story organizes itself. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which prohibits the use of the military for domestic law enforcement except as specifically authorized by law, had been interpreted for nearly a century to mean that the army did not operate inside the country against the country's own citizens in the way that a domestic law enforcement agency might. There were exceptions: the National Guard, the use of federal troops to enforce desegregation orders, but these were specific and legally authorized. What CONUS Intel was doing was not specific and was not legally authorized. There were no guidelines. There was no oversight mechanism. There was no judicial review. There was no statute that said the Army could send agents onto college campuses to photograph students and copy attendance rosters and build personality files on civilians who had been charged with nothing. The Army simply built the program from scratch, improvising as it went, sending agents onto college campuses and into church basements and union halls and political meetings without warrants, without probable cause, without any of the procedural safeguards that would have applied if they had been investigating actual criminals. The agents were drawn from military intelligence units that had been trained for operations in foreign countries, gathering intelligence on foreign populations for purposes of counterinsurgency and force protection. They were now being asked to apply those skills domestically, to treat the United States as an operational environment and American citizens as the population to be monitored. And the transfer of those skills from the foreign to the domestic context happened without anyone apparently pausing to note that the legal and ethical framework governing foreign intelligence operations did not apply domestically, and that there was no comparable domestic framework to replace it. The agents took notes. They photographed people. They opened mail. They attended rallies under false pretenses, posing as students, as journalists, as sympathizers, sometimes making speeches under assumed names that were reported in the press as the words of authentic movement participants. They compiled what they called personality files on individuals who had caught their attention, and those files grew and multiplied and were cross-referenced and indexed until the database at Fort Holabird in Maryland, the Army's primary intelligence repository, held information on more than 100,000 civilians. Senator Adlai Stevenson, III of Illinois, was in there. Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee was in there. The civil rights attorney, William Kunstler, was in there. The pediatrician and peace activist, Benjamin Spock, who had been tried for conspiracy to counsel draft evasion and whose conviction had been overturned on appeal, was in there. The folk singer Joan Baez was in there. The congressman, Abner Mikva, who would later serve as a federal judge and White House counsel, was in there. The journalist I.F. Stone, whose newsletter Stone's Weekly was read by hundreds of thousands of people and who had been among the earliest and most consistent critics of the Vietnam War, was in there. Not because any of them had done anything illegal, because they had spoken in public, or marched in public, or signed their names to documents the government had decided it wanted to know about, or attended meetings that the government had decided it wanted to monitor, or written things that the government had decided it wanted to file. The criteria for inclusion were never precisely defined, which meant in practice that any agent who decided someone was worth watching could begin watching them, and the file would grow, and the growth of the file would itself become a justification for continued watching, because a large file implied importance, and importance implied that the watching should continue. What made the Army's program more than an administrative curiosity, what made it something genuinely dangerous and genuinely corrosive to the democratic order it was nominally designed to protect, was not the existence of the files themselves, but what those files were used for, and who could access them, and what happened when the information they contained migrated out of one agency and into the hands of another, with different capabilities and different institutional cultures and different ideas about what to do with intelligence once you had it. The Army was not operating alone. The CONUS Intel program existed within a broader ecosystem of domestic intelligence activity that included, at minimum, the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, the NSA's Project Minaret, and the CIA's Operation Chaos, all of which were running simultaneously, all of which were collecting information on overlapping target populations, and none of which had adequate legal authorization for what they were doing or adequate oversight from the civilian institutions that were nominally responsible for ensuring that the government did not turn its intelligence apparatus against its own citizens. The result was a surveillance ecology, a term that suggests both the organic, self-sustaining character of what had developed and the degree to which its components existed in mutual dependence, feeding each other, sharing resources, amplifying each other's reach in ways that none of them could have achieved individually. That was, by the late 1960s, monitoring the political activity of a substantial fraction of the politically active American population, cataloging it, analyzing it, and in many cases using it as the basis for active efforts to disrupt, discredit, and destroy the individuals and organizations it had identified as threats. The threat designations were elastic. The category of domestic subversive, which had been developed to describe actual communist agents and sympathizers in the early Cold War period, had expanded by the late 1960s to include essentially anyone who was persistently critical of American foreign policy, anyone who organized politically against the Vietnam War, anyone who participated in the civil rights movement in ways that the FBI's leadership found threatening, anyone who was associated with organizations that had members who fit the previous descriptions. By 1968, the FBI's files identified more than 500,000 individuals and organizations as domestic security threats. The number tells you everything you need to know about the integrity of the threat assessment. A country with 200 million people does not have 500,000 internal security threats. It has a threat assessment framework that has lost any meaningful connection to the distinction between genuine threat and political opposition. At almost exactly the same time the CONUS Intel program was expanding through 1966, 1967, and 1968, the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, which had originally been directed at the Communist Party USA when it was formally established in 1956, had extended its reach to encompass a set of targets that bore decreasing resemblance to what most people would recognize as a security threat. The Students for a Democratic Society, a campus organization whose founding document, the Port Huron Statement of 1962, called for participatory democracy and expressed concern about nuclear weapons and racial injustice, became a COINTELPRO target. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the civil rights organization that had organized the Freedom Rides and the Selma to Montgomery marches, became a COINTELPRO target. The Socialist Workers' Party, a legal political party that ran candidates for public office, became a COINTELPRO target. Women Strike for Peace, an organization founded by women who were worried about nuclear testing and opposed to the Vietnam War, became a COINTELPRO target. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization, was a COINTELPRO target. These organizations shared nothing except a willingness to criticize the government, and in some cases, their criticisms were more moderate than those being expressed on the editorial pages of mainstream newspapers. What they shared, in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, was an unwillingness to be quiet, a persistence in public opposition to policies the FBI's director had decided were correct, and whose critics were therefore, by definition, either misguided or malicious. Hoover had been running domestic intelligence since 1919. He had built the FBI from a small Justice Department investigative unit into the dominant domestic law enforcement and intelligence agency in the country. And he had done it partly through genuine investigative work and partly through the cultivation of political relationships that gave him leverage over the elected officials who were nominally his superiors. He understood, better than perhaps anyone else in Washington, that raw surveillance is only one tool and that the more powerful tool is disruption. COINTELPRO was not, at its core, a surveillance program. It was an active measures program, a term borrowed from Soviet intelligence doctrine that describes operations designed not merely to gather information about a target, but to actively shape the target's environment in ways that weaken or destroy it. The FBI did not merely watch the organizations it targeted. It sent anonymous letters to their members, accusing their leaders of financial corruption, sexual infidelity, and government collaboration. It sent letters to the employers of activists, falsely suggesting that the activist had a criminal record or was under active federal investigation. It forged documents in the names of movement leaders and circulated them to rival organizations, manufacturing feuds that did not exist and deepening feuds that did. It contacted the landlords of movement offices and suggested that their tenants were involved in illegal activity, encouraging eviction. It contacted the parents of young activists and sent them fabricated information about their children's activities designed to alarm and alienate. It sent fabricated letters, purportedly from one civil rights organization to another, accusing the recipient of financial impropriety or collaboration with the FBI, creating suspicion and conflict that the FBI then monitored and reported on as evidence of organizational dysfunction. The operation against the Black Panther Party included the production and circulation of a fabricated letter from the Black Panther leadership to the United Slaves Organization, claiming that United Slaves members were planning to assassinate Panther leaders, a lie that was inserted into an already volatile situation and that contributed to an atmosphere of inter-organizational violence in which 4 Black Panthers were killed. These were not the unauthorized actions of rogue agents operating outside the Bureau's knowledge. They were authorized operations, approved through the FBI's chain of command, documented in internal memos that used the flat bureaucratic language of case management, operational proposal, target assessment, projected impact, to describe activities that, had they been conducted by a foreign intelligence service against American citizens on American soil, would immediately have been classified as hostile foreign intelligence operations and treated as acts of aggression. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI ran more than 2,000 documented COINTELPRO operations against domestic organizations. The actual number is almost certainly higher because the program was specifically designed to leave no fingerprints, to disrupt without being traceable, to destroy without being accountable, to achieve its goals in ways that would not connect back to the Bureau, even if the target became suspicious. The instructions Hoover sent to field offices were explicit about this. The techniques used must be those that will not embarrass the Bureau, not the techniques that are legal, not the techniques that are proportionate, the techniques that will not embarrass the Bureau. Embarrassment, not legality, was the operative constraint, and the constraint tells you everything about the moral framework within which these decisions were being made. While the Army was watching and the FBI was disrupting, a third institution was doing something that was, in some ways, the most technically brazen of the 3 operations, because it involved turning the capabilities of the most sophisticated signals intelligence agency in the world directly against the citizens of the country that agency existed to protect. The National Security Agency had been established in 1952 as the successor to the code-breaking operations of World War II, and its formal mandate was signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of foreign communications directed at foreign targets. It was not supposed to collect on American citizens. The legal framework governing the NSA, such as it was in the 1960s, assumed a clear distinction between the foreign communications that were the agency's proper target and the domestic communications that were protected by the Constitution from warrantless government interception. Project Minaret erased that distinction. The program, which began in 1967 and ran until 1973, maintained a watch list of American citizens whose communications were to be collected and analyzed by the NSA's intercept stations. At its peak, the watch list contained 1,650 American names. They included the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., whose foreign communications the NSA was collecting at the same time the FBI was wiretapping his domestic phones and bugging his hotel rooms. They included the boxer Muhammad Ali, who had refused military induction on conscientious objector grounds and who was then one of the most prominent public opponents of the Vietnam War. They included the actress and activist Jane Fonda. They included the pediatrician Benjamin Spock. They included the journalists Tom Wicker of the New York Times and Art Buchwald of the Washington Post. And they included 2 United States senators, Frank Church of Idaho and Howard Baker of Tennessee, who would both later serve on the committee that investigated the program that had been collecting their communications. The NSA collected their cables, their telegrams, their overseas phone calls. It analyzed the content. It passed what it found to the FBI, to the CIA, to the Defense Intelligence Agency. It did this without warrants. It did this without any legal authority that any court would have recognized as sufficient. Its own lawyers knew this. In a 1969 internal memorandum, NSA General Counsel reviewed the watchlist program and concluded that it raised serious questions under the Fourth Amendment and that the agency's legal exposure from the program was substantial. The program continued anyway for 4 more years because the people who ran it had decided that the intelligence value outweighed the legal risk, which was the same calculation that every other agency involved in domestic surveillance had made, and which revealed the same fundamental attitude, that the legal framework was an obstacle to be managed rather than a constraint to be respected. When NSA Director Lou Allen testified before the Church Committee in 1975 and confirmed the existence of Minaret, he acknowledged that the program had operated without adequate legal authorization and that the watch list had included American citizens who had engaged in no foreign intelligence activity. He could not identify a single case in which Minaret had produced intelligence that had prevented a terrorist attack, or caught a foreign spy, or served any of the national security purposes that the program's existence was supposed to justify. What it had produced in 6 years of operation was a substantial collection of information about the private communications of Americans whose primary distinguishing characteristic was that they were opposed to the Vietnam War, or active in the civil rights movement, or both. The operational intersection of these programs, the places where the Army's files fed the FBI's disruption operations, where the NSA's intercepts informed the CIA's analysis, where information moved between agencies without authorization and without accountability, is where the surveillance ecology became something more than the sum of its parts and something more dangerous than any individual program would have been. There is a documented case in which information from the Army's CONUS intel files was passed to local law enforcement agencies and used to justify surveillance of individuals who had no criminal record and no pending investigation. There are documented cases in which NSA intercepts of American citizens' communications were passed to the FBI and used as the basis for COINTELPRO disruption operations directed at the people whose communications had been intercepted. There is a documented case in which CIA information derived from Operation Chaos, the agency's own domestic surveillance program, which by 1974 held files on 7,200 Americans and had indexed 300,000 names, was used to brief university administrators about faculty members the agency had identified as security concerns. Briefings that in some cases preceded or accompanied pressure on those administrators to take adverse employment action. The people inside this ecology had, over years of operation, lost almost entirely the habit of asking whether what they were doing was permissible. The machinery had its own momentum. It generated work, and the work generated more work. And the more work there was, the more people were needed to do it, and the more people there were, the more the program justified its own existence. And the more the program justified its own existence, the harder it became to ask whether the justification was real. There is a document in the FBI's files, released under the Freedom of Information Act decades later, in which an agent describes a COINTELPRO operation designed to get a professor at a Midwestern university fired from his position. The professor had spoken at an anti-war rally. He had not advocated violence. He had not called for the overthrow of the government. He had said, at a public event, that the war in Vietnam was wrong, and that the young men dying in it were dying for a policy he believed was mistaken. The FBI sent an anonymous letter to the university's board of trustees, falsely claiming that the professor had a history of communist affiliation and was currently under active federal investigation for subversive activities. The professor was not under investigation. The FBI had invented the communist affiliation claim, had fabricated the suggestion of an ongoing investigation, and had delivered these fabrications to people who lacked both the means to verify them and the institutional courage to treat an anonymous letter from what appeared to be a federal source with the skepticism it deserved. The professor was not fired. The university's president, to his credit, reviewed the letter and, suspicious of its anonymous provenance and its unverifiable claims, declined to act on it. The FBI file notes this as an operational failure. The tone is entirely matter of fact. We attempted to have this individual removed from his position. The attempt failed. We will consider alternative approaches. There is no reflection on the morality of the attempt. There is no question raised about whether a government agency should be trying to destroy the career of a man who had spoken at a rally. The only question the file raises is how to achieve the goal more effectively next time. And the answer, the file suggests, a different approach implies that the next attempt will be made because the goal has not changed, only the method has failed. The specific cases of individuals whose lives were disrupted or destroyed by these programs, the cases that the Church Committee investigated, that subsequent FOIA requests revealed, that the slowly declassifying historical record has continued to produce, constitute a kind of shadow history of the Vietnam era, a parallel account of what was happening to specific people at the same time that the official history was being written. Owen Lattimore, the Johns Hopkins professor, whom McCarthy had targeted in 1950, and whose case had dragged through the courts for 5 years, was in FBI files that had been accumulating since before COINTELPRO was formally established. The writer James Baldwin, whose essays about race and American identity were among the most widely read and discussed works of the 1960s, had an FBI file that eventually ran to nearly 2,000 pages, and that documented the Bureau's monitoring of his associations, his travels, his relationships, and his public statements over more than 2 decades, with particular attention to any statement that could be interpreted as critical of American foreign policy or sympathetic to radical political positions. The historian Stoughton Lynd, who traveled to Hanoi with Tom Hayden in 1965 and who had his passport revoked by the State Department in response, was the subject of surveillance by multiple agencies and of COINTELPRO operations directed at his professional relationships and his academic career. The comedian and social critic Dick Gregory, who was active in the civil rights movement and who became one of the most prominent celebrity opponents of the Vietnam War, had a substantial FBI file and was the subject of operations designed to damage his professional reputation. The activist and former Army officer Howard Zinn, whose teaching at Boston University combined academic work with anti-war activism, and who would later write A People's History of the United States, was monitored for years by the FBI and was the subject of at least one documented attempt to have him removed from his university position through the kind of anonymous letter campaign that the COINTELPRO documents describe as standard operating procedure. None of these people were charged with crimes in connection with the activities that made them surveillance targets. None of them were convicted of anything. Several of them spent years filing FOIA requests and reviewing their own files after the church committee's disclosures made clear that files existed, and the process of reading those files, seeing oneself as the object of sustained institutional hostility, reading the language in which federal agents described one's own public activities and private associations, was an experience that those who have written about it describe as profoundly disorienting. The discovery that the EEE, government of one's own country, had been treating one as an enemy for years without legal authority and without any intention of acknowledging what it was doing. The question of who knew, specifically what the presidents of the Vietnam era knew about the surveillance programs being run in their names and how much they had directed versus simply permitted, is one that the historical record answers with a clarity that the principals, in their subsequent accounts, consistently tried to muddy. Lyndon Johnson knew about the FBI's surveillance of the anti-war movement and used it. He requested specific derogatory information from Hoover about the associations and backgrounds of prominent movement figures, information that he used to assess the political threat they posed, and in some cases to respond to that threat by selectively leaking damaging material to friendly journalists. Johnson was particularly interested in any information Hoover could supply about senators and congressmen who were moving toward public opposition to the war, because that information gave him advance warning of political challenges, and in some cases gave him leverage he could use against potential opponents. He also requested and received FBI intelligence about the activities of the delegations attending the 1968 Democratic National Convention, including intelligence about his own party's delegates that was gathered through electronic surveillance and informant placement that had no legal basis. The Johnson White House's use of FBI intelligence was extensive enough that Hoover assigned a specific liaison to handle the flow of information to the White House, and the liaison relationship operated with a regularity and a volume that made clear that the surveillance was not an occasional resource the president drew on in specific emergencies, but a routine instrument of political intelligence that the administration treated as a normal tool of governance. Richard Nixon was worse and worse in ways that went beyond the quantitative expansion of surveillance programs that his administration authorized and into the qualitative question of what the surveillance was for. Nixon's conviction that the anti-war movement was a coordinated subversive operation directed from abroad was not the product of intelligence analysis. It was a prior belief that intelligence analysis was being used to confirm rather than to evaluate, and when the intelligence analysis consistently failed to find the foreign direction that Nixon knew had to be there, he responded not by revising the belief, but by expanding the intelligence collection and demanding better results. He told Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, that the movement needed to be infiltrated and disrupted. He met regularly with Hoover and with the CIA director and with military intelligence officials and pressed them for more aggressive operations against the domestic opposition. He directed the creation of the Intelligence Evaluation Committee, a body whose purpose was to coordinate the domestic intelligence activities of the various agencies and to produce the kind of comprehensive picture of domestic subversion that Nixon was convinced the evidence supported. The picture the committee produced was not the picture Nixon wanted, because the evidence for the foreign direction he was looking for was not there, but the committee's existence and the surveillance activities it coordinated continued regardless, because the institutional momentum of the programs had, by this point, become largely independent of the intelligence justification that had been used to create them. The Houston Plan of 1970 is the most explicit documentary evidence of what the Nixon administration was prepared to authorize in the way of domestic surveillance, because it is the document that describes, in formal written terms, the full range of activities the administration was considering. Tom Charles Houston was a 29-year-old White House aide with a background in conservative politics and a conviction that the existing surveillance programs were inadequate to the threat the administration believed it was facing. He wrote a plan that proposed the formal authorization of activities that were already happening informally. Warrantless break-ins into the homes and offices of domestic political opponents, mail opening, expanded electronic surveillance, and the infiltration of campus organizations by agents who would be younger and less visible than the existing FBI informant corps. The plan also proposed institutional changes that would have given the White House more direct control over the intelligence community's domestic operations, reducing the autonomy that the FBI and the CIA had exercised in managing their own programs. Nixon approved the plan. It was approved on July 14, 1970, with a presidential signature that constituted the most explicit written authorization of illegal domestic surveillance that any administration had ever produced. The plan was then withdrawn 5 days later because J. Edgar Hoover objected to it. Hoover's objection was not on civil liberties grounds. He was running warrantless programs of his own and had been for decades. His objection was institutional. He did not want his bureau placed in a coordinating relationship with the military and the CIA that would require the FBI to share information and jurisdiction with agencies he regarded as rivals, and he did not want his name on a document that authorized illegal activities in writing, because he understood that written authorization was the thing that eventually ended up in congressional hearing rooms. And he had a lifetime's experience of the consequences of that kind of exposure. Hoover's objection killed the Houston Plan, which was withdrawn and formally rescinded. Nixon then continued doing, informally and without the paper trail that the Houston Plan would have created, most of what the plan had proposed. The break-ins happened, the mail openings happened, the surveillance expanded. It happened without written presidential authorization, which meant it happened with deniability built into the process, which was exactly what Hoover had been doing for decades, and which Nixon's own subsequent conduct during Watergate suggests he understood to be the appropriate operational posture for activities that the law did not permit. The moment the structure began to crack open was not dramatic in the way that great exposures are sometimes dramatic in the telling. It did not happen because a principled insider made a heroic decision to sacrifice their career for the truth, though those insiders would come later. It happened because 8 people, some of them with connections to the anti-war movement, and some of them simply outraged by what they had heard was happening inside the FBI, drove on a Tuesday night in early March to a small town in Pennsylvania called Media, located the local FBI field office in a building on the main street, broke in through a back door while the town's attention was focused on the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier fight being broadcast that evening, and took everything they could find. It was March 8th, 1971, and the group called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. And what they took from the Media field office was not a targeted selection of incriminating documents, but every document in the office, all the files, all the memos, all the field reports, all the surveillance logs, everything, which they loaded into suitcases and drove away with, leaving behind an empty filing room and a broken lock and a case that the FBI would never solve. The group spent several weeks going through what they had taken, sorting the documents by subject, assessing their significance, making photocopies. They mailed copies to journalists and members of Congress, anonymously with covering letters that explained what the documents were and why they had been taken. Most journalists who received the materials were reluctant to publish. The combination of the documents' classified status and the manner of their acquisition made publication legally and institutionally complicated, and several news organizations that received copies consulted lawyers and editors and ultimately decided not to run with them. The Washington Post was the exception. Katharine Graham, the Post's publisher, and Ben Bradley, its editor, reviewed the documents with the Post's legal counsel and ultimately decided that the public interest in what the documents revealed outweighed the legal risk of publishing material obtained through a burglary, a decision that required considerable institutional courage at a moment when the Nixon administration had already demonstrated its willingness to pursue legal action against the press, and when the FBI was actively investigating who had taken the documents and would presumably be unhappy about their publication. The Post published. The New York Times and the Los Angeles Times followed. What the documents showed was a systematic program. The word COINTELPRO appeared in the Media documents for the first time in public, and it meant something concrete and documented rather than something alleged, of surveillance and disruption directed at lawful political organizations using methods that no one had authorized and that no law permitted. The documents were specific enough that the program's existence was no longer deniable, though the Bureau's initial public response was to insist that the Media documents had been taken out of context and that the Bureau's activities were entirely lawful and appropriate. This response was not credible to anyone who read the documents carefully, and the pressure generated by the Media revelations combined with the pressure of Christopher Pyle's earlier Washington Monthly article and the congressional investigations that Pyle's article had prompted was sufficient to produce, in May 1971, Hoover's quiet termination of COINTELPRO as a formal program. The activities COINTELPRO had been authorizing did not stop immediately or completely, but the formal program ended, and with it ended the institutional framework through which the activities had been approved and documented, which meant that what continued afterward was harder to trace and harder to stop. The Church Committee's investigation, which ran from January 1975 to April 1976, and produced the most comprehensive public accounting of what the intelligence agencies had been doing during this period, is the documentary foundation on which everything subsequent understanding of this history rests, and it is worth examining in some detail not merely for what it found, but for how it found it, and what the process of finding it revealed about the relationship between the intelligence community and the constitutional order it was supposed to serve. The committee was established by a Senate resolution in January 1975, following a series of revelations, the CIA's involvement in the Watergate affair, press reports of domestic surveillance programs, The initial disclosure by journalist Seymour Hersh in the New York Times in December 1974 of the CIA's illegal domestic operations, that had convinced enough senators that a comprehensive investigation was necessary and that it could not be conducted by the existing oversight committees, which had developed relationships with the agencies they were supposed to oversee that made genuine independence difficult. Frank Church of Idaho, who was named to chair the committee, was a senator with a background in law and a long-standing interest in foreign policy, who brought to the chairmanship both the analytical capacity to understand what the intelligence agencies were doing and the political skill to manage the inevitable resistance that the investigation would encounter from the agencies themselves, from the administration, and from members of the committee who had their own institutional relationships with the intelligence community to protect. The committee had 17 members, drawn from both parties, and its staff eventually numbered more than 150 investigators, lawyers, and analysts who worked for more than a year reviewing classified documents, taking testimony from current and former intelligence officials, and interviewing the targets of the programs whose existence the investigation was documenting. The resistance the committee encountered from the intelligence agencies was substantial and took multiple forms. Documents were slow to arrive, and sometimes arrived in conditions that suggested careful review and selective disclosure before production. Witnesses were sometimes evasive in ways that stopped just short of the perjury that would have created serious legal exposure. The Ford administration, which had inherited the programs the committee was investigating and which had institutional reasons to protect the intelligence community's equities, engaged in a sustained effort to limit the committee's access to the most sensitive materials on the grounds of ongoing intelligence operations and foreign liaison relationships that publication would damage. Church and the committee's majority pushed back against these limitations with varying degrees of success, ultimately gaining access to enough of the underlying documentation to produce the comprehensive public report that the committee released in 1976, a report that ran to more than 90,000 pages in its full classified version, and to a still substantial public version that documented, in enough detail to be genuinely informative, the specific programs, the specific operations, the specific individuals targeted, and the specific legal and constitutional violations that the programs represented. The report found that the FBI had opened more than 500,000 domestic intelligence files on American citizens and organizations between 1960 and 1974. It found that the NSA's Minaret program had collected communications from approximately 1,650 American citizens without legal authority. It found that the CIA's Chaos program had compiled files on 7,200 Americans and indexed 300,000 names. It found that the Army's CONUS Intel program had held files on 100,000 civilians in its computerized database. It found that these programs had, in combination, been used not merely to gather intelligence about genuine security threats, but to actively disrupt, discredit, and in some cases destroy organizations and individuals whose primary offense was the expression of political views that the agency's leadership had decided were dangerous. Church, in his summary statement introducing the final report, described the intelligence agencies as having formed a virtual fourth branch of government that had operated outside the constitutional checks and balances that were supposed to ensure democratic accountability. It was not an overstatement. The legislative response to the Church Committee's findings was substantial and, in the immediate aftermath of the investigation, ambitious. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which created the FISA Court as a specialized judicial body, to review warrant applications for surveillance of foreign intelligence agents operating in the United States, was the most significant structural reform because it created a legal framework where essentially none had previously existed and established the principle that even national security surveillance of people inside the United States required some form of judicial authorization. The Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980 created formal mechanisms for congressional oversight of intelligence activities, requiring the agencies to keep the relevant committees informed of covert operations and significant intelligence activities in advance, rather than after the fact or not at all. The attorney declassified General's Guidelines for Domestic FBI Operations, issued by Edward Levi in 1976 and subsequently revised and reissued by multiple successors, established for the first time formal internal standards governing when and how the FBI could open domestic intelligence investigations, what predication was required, what procedures had to be followed, and what oversight mechanisms applied. These reforms were real. They changed, measurably and demonstrably, the way domestic intelligence activities were conducted in the years immediately following their implementation. The FBI in 1978 was not the FBI of 1968. The standards were different. The oversight was more real. The legal framework, however imperfect, was more constraining than the essentially lawless environment in which COINTELPRO had operated. What the reforms could not do was undo what had already been done, restore the careers that had been damaged, reassemble the organizations that had been destroyed, or return to the people who had been neutralized, in the FBI's clinical terminology, the years of productive work and political engagement that the neutralization had cost them. The neutralization had been effective. The organizations the FBI had most successfully disrupted, the Black Panther Party, the Students for a Democratic Society, several of the more radical elements of the civil rights movement, did not recover because the specific damage that disruption causes to organizations built on trust and solidarity is damage that organizational rebuilding cannot fully repair once it has been done. The suspicion that had been planted remained. The conflicts that had been manufactured became real. The people who had been turned against each other through fabricated documents did not subsequently become allies again, simply because they learned that the conflict between them had been engineered. The damage, in the cases where the disruption had worked, was permanent, and the permanence is the point. The program was designed to produce permanent damage, and in the cases where it succeeded, it produced exactly what it was designed to produce, and no subsequent reform or revelation or apology, and the government has never actually apologized to the targets of COINTELPRO, has reversed the specific consequences of the specific operations that succeeded. A democracy that spies on its own citizens for the offense of disagreeing with the government has not yet fully reckoned with what it did during those years, and the reckoning is complicated by the degree to which the full documentary record remains incomplete. The files that the Church Committee reviewed, the files that FOIA requests have produced in the decades since, the files that researchers and journalists and the targets themselves have obtained through years of legal effort, these represent a substantial fraction of what exists, but not the whole. Certain categories of documents relating to NSA domestic intercepts remain classified, or only partially declassified. The FBI's files on specific individuals and specific operations are released in forms that contain substantial redactions, sometimes redactions so extensive that the released document conveys little beyond the fact that something was done. The operational details of specific COINTELPRO actions, the specific letters sent, the specific recipients, the specific results, are available for some operations and unavailable for others, which means that the historical record of what the programs accomplished is almost certainly incomplete in the direction of underestimating their scope and their effectiveness. What we know is enough. What we know documents a sustained, deliberate, institutionally authorized campaign by agencies of the United States government to suppress lawful political activity through illegal means, conducted against a population that had done nothing except exercise the rights that the Constitution was supposed to guarantee, and conducted with sufficient effectiveness that the political landscape of the United States in the 1970s and beyond was measurably different from what it would have been if the programs had not operated. The voices that were silenced, the organizations that were destroyed, the political possibilities that were foreclosed, these are the negative spaces in the history of the period, the things that are not there because they were prevented from being there. And their absence is the most consequential and least visible consequence of the programs. The phrase that appears in those FBI field reports, the goal of neutralization, is the phrase that makes the purpose clear. Not arrest, not prosecution, not the engagement with political opposition that a democracy is supposed to conduct through argument and persuasion and the ballot box. Neutralization. The removal of inconvenient voices from the political conversation by whatever means were available, conducted in secret, without legal authority by agencies that had decided, without democratic authorization, that the conversation would go better without those particular participants. The decision was wrong. The implementation was comprehensive. The consequences were lasting. And the institutions that made the decision have never been held fully accountable for it.